The world you wake up in was not designed by accident. Every border drawn on a map, every language spoken in distant lands, every economic system that governs your daily life, they all carry the fingerprints of empires long dissolved. Imperialism did not merely conquer territories. It rewrote the story of humanity itself, deciding who would prosper and who would struggle, who would be remembered and who would be erased. Tonight, as the world outside your window settles into stillness, let us journey back through time, not to glorify or condemn, but to understand, to see how ambition, greed, discovery, and ideology collided across centuries, reshaping continents and souls alike. This is not just history. This is the architecture of the modern world, built on foundations both brilliant and brutal. And as you drift closer to sleep, let these stories carry you gently through the rise and fall of empires that believed they could own the earth. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. Subscribe and let history become your companion in the quiet hours. There was a time, long before the world was mapped and measured, when the sea was a mystery and the horizon held secrets no one dared to chase. Sailors spoke in hushed tones of waters that boiled, of edges where ships might tumble into nothing, of monsters coiled in the deep, waiting for the foolish. But hunger has always been stronger than fear. Hunger for gold, for spices, for glory, for knowledge. And so, despite the warnings whispered in port towns and coastal villages, men began to sail beyond the known world. They carried with them compasses, astrolabes, ambition, and something far more dangerous than any weapon. They carried the belief that discovery was a form of ownership. In the 15th century, Europe was waking from a long slumber. The Renaissance had rekindled curiosity. Ancient texts were being rediscovered, translated, debated. The earth, scholars now whispered, might not be flat after all. And if it was round, then perhaps there were routes to the east that did not require crossing hostile empires by land. The Ottoman Empire controlled the overland trade routes to Asia, choking the flow of silk, porcelain, and the precious spices that flavored European meals and preserved their food. Black pepper was worth its weight in silver. Nutmeg and cloves could make a merchant wealthy beyond imagination. But the middlemen took their share at every stop, inflating prices until only the richest could afford them. Europe wanted direct access. And so the age of exploration was born, not from noble curiosity, but from economic desperation dressed in the language of adventure. Portugal was the first to truly commit. Prince Henry the Navigator, a man who rarely sailed himself, established a school of navigation and funded expedition after expedition down the coast of Africa. Each voyage pushed a little further. Each captain returned with maps a little more complete. Slowly, painfully, the Portuguese crept southward, hugging the African coastline, trading with coastal kingdoms, establishing fortified posts. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa had an edge, that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans met. A decade later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey, reaching India and returning to Lisbon with a cargo of spices that made his investors fabulously wealthy. The sea route to Asia was open, and with it, the door to empire swung wide. But exploration was never just about trade. Every ship that sailed carried more than goods and sailors. It carried assumptions. It carried the belief that Christian Europe was destined to spread its faith, its culture, its systems to the corners of the earth. The doctrine of discovery, endorsed by papal bulls, declared that non-Christian lands were essentially empty, available for claiming by any Christian monarch whose subjects planted a flag there. Indigenous peoples, their civilizations, their histories, none of it mattered in the eyes of the explorers. They were obstacles, or opportunities, or invisible altogether. And so as Portuguese caravels touched the shores of Africa and Asia, they did not come as guests, they came as claimants. Spain watched Portugal's success with envy and alarm. When Christopher Columbus proposed sailing west to reach the east, Spain's monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella saw an opportunity to compete. In 1492, Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, carrying with him the blessing of the crown and the promise of gold. He did not find Asia, he found the Caribbean, lands inhabited by the Taíno people, communities that had lived there for centuries. Columbus called them Indians, believing he had reached the Indies. He marveled at their generosity, their willingness to trade, their lack of weapons. In his journal, he noted how easily they could be enslaved. Within decades, the Taíno population would be decimated by disease, forced labor, and violence. Columbus's voyages opened the Americas to European colonization, and with it began one of history's greatest tragedies, the conquest and exploitation of entire continents. And so the pattern was set. Exploration became conquest, trade became extraction, curiosity became domination. The world was no longer a place to discover, it was a place to claim. And as the 16th century dawned, the seeds of empire had been planted in every corner of the globe. The Spanish conquest of the Americas unfolded with a speed and brutality that still echoes through history. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519 with fewer than 600 men, yet within 2 years, the mighty Aztec Empire had fallen. How could so few conquer so many? The answer lay not in Spanish superiority, but in a perfect storm of circumstances. The Spanish brought horses, animals unknown in the Americas, which terrified warriors who had never seen a human and beast move as one. They brought steel swords and armor, harder than anything the indigenous peoples possessed. They brought firearms, primitive by modern standards, but loud and deadly enough to shock enemies into hesitation. But most devastatingly, they brought diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, pathogens, to which Europeans had developed some resistance over centuries, but which ravaged indigenous populations with no immunity. Entire cities were emptied by illness before a single battle was fought, and Cortés, cunning and ruthless, exploited the political fractures within the Aztec Empire, allying with subjugated peoples who saw the Spanish as potential liberators, not realizing they were trading one empire for something far worse. Further south, Francisco Pizarro did the same to the Inca Empire. In 1532, with barely 200 men, he captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa during a meeting that was supposed to be peaceful. Pizarro demanded a ransom of gold and silver so vast it filled entire rooms. The Inca paid it. Pizarro executed Atahualpa anyway and seized control of the empire. Within a generation, Spanish rule stretched from the Caribbean to the southern tip of South America. The conquistadors were followed by missionaries, administrators, and settlers. Indigenous religions were banned, temples were torn down, and churches built on their foundations. Ancient codices containing centuries of accumulated knowledge were burned as heretical. Languages were suppressed. Children were taken from their families and raised in Christian schools where they were taught to forget who they were. The conquest was not just military, it was cultural, spiritual, psychological. It was the beginning of a systematic erasure that would define imperialism for centuries to come. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Portuguese were carving out their own empire. Unlike the Spanish, who focused on the Americas, Portugal looked east. They established fortified trading posts along the coasts of Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China and Japan. The Portuguese Empire was not about settling vast territories with European farmers. It was about controlling trade routes, monopolizing the spice trade, and extracting wealth. They built forts at strategic choke points, Goa in India, Malacca in Malaysia, Macau in China, and used naval power to force local rulers into exclusive trade agreements. Any ship that wanted to trade in the Indian Ocean had to buy a license from the Portuguese or risk being attacked. It was protection money on a global scale, and it worked. For nearly a century, Portugal dominated maritime trade in Asia, funneling unimaginable wealth back to Lisbon. But the Portuguese and Spanish were not alone for long. By the late 16th century, other European powers were watching, learning, and preparing to compete. England, France, and the Netherlands had been relative latecomers to the age of exploration, distracted by religious wars and internal conflicts. But as they stabilized, they turned their attention outward. The Dutch, in particular, proved to be ruthless competitors. In 1602, they established the Dutch East India Company, a corporation given extraordinary powers by the state, the right to wage war, negotiate treaties, and govern territories. It was a private company with the authority of a nation, and it used that authority to seize control of the Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia. The Dutch did not just trade for spices, they enforced brutal monopolies, destroying spice trees on islands they did not control to artificially inflate prices. Entire populations were enslaved or massacred to maintain dominance. The pursuit of profit became indistinguishable from the logic of empire. England followed a similar path, chartering its own East India Company in 1600. Initially focused on trade, the company gradually accumulated political and military power in India, exploiting divisions between local rulers, backing some against others, and slowly transforming from a trading entity into a governing force. By the 18th century, the British East India Company controlled vast territories, collected taxes, maintained armies, and effectively ruled over millions of people. It was empire by corporation, profit wrapped in the language of civilization and progress, and it set the template for a new kind of imperialism, one that did not require direct state control, only the machinery of commerce backed by force. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the world had changed beyond recognition. What had begun as exploration, driven by curiosity, commerce, and competition, had transformed into something far darker. European powers had claimed entire continents, disrupted ancient trade networks, toppled empires, enslaved millions, and rewritten the maps to reflect their dominance. The age of empire had truly begun, and humanity, whether conqueror or conquered, would never be the same. The seeds planted by those early explorers had grown into forests of power, vast and entangled, casting shadows that stretched across oceans and centuries. Yet beneath all the grand narratives of conquest and empire, there were quieter stories that the history books often forgot to tell. In every port where European ships docked, in every trading post established on foreign soil, there were moments of contact between worlds. Some of these moments were violent, yes, but others were marked by curiosity, negotiation, even friendship. Indigenous guides led explorers through unfamiliar terrain, sharing knowledge of rivers, mountains, and safe passages. Local merchants engaged in complex negotiations, translating not just languages but entire systems of value and exchange. Women became intermediaries, marrying European traders and serving as cultural bridges between their people and the newcomers. These individuals navigated impossible positions, trying to protect their communities while adapting to a reality that was shifting beneath their feet like sand. But the empire builders rarely acknowledged these contributions. In their telling, they were the heroes, the discoverers, the civilizers. The indigenous peoples were backdrop, obstacles, or beneficiaries of European enlightenment. This narrative was not accidental, it was essential to justifying what was being done. If the lands were empty, then taking them was not theft. If the people were primitive, then subjugating them was a kindness. If the cultures were barbaric, then destroying them was progress. And so the stories were written and rewritten, printed in books, taught in schools, repeated until they became truth in the minds of those who benefited from empire. The psychology of imperialism required this myth-making. It required believing that conquest was destiny, that dominance was natural, that some peoples were simply born to rule, while others were born to serve. The economic engine of empire was equally ruthless in its logic. The mercantile system that dominated European thought in the 17th and 18th centuries held that a nation's wealth was measured in gold and silver, and that colonies existed solely to enrich the mother country. Colonial economies were structured to extract raw materials and ship them back to Europe, where they would be transformed into manufactured goods and sold back to the colonies at inflated prices. It was a closed loop designed to ensure that wealth flowed in one direction only. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, silver mines in Peru, fur trading posts in North America, all of them existed to feed European appetites and European treasuries. And when local labor proved insufficient or resistant, the empire builders turned to slavery on a scale never before seen in human history. The transatlantic slave trade became the dark heart of imperial expansion in the Americas. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, more than 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in conditions so horrific that millions died before ever reaching land. Those who survived were sold into lifetimes of bondage, working plantations that produced sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee for European and American markets. Families were torn apart. Cultures were fragmented. Languages were lost. And yet, even in this unimaginable brutality, enslaved peoples found ways to resist, to preserve memory, to create new forms of culture and community. They sang songs that carried coded messages of resistance. They practiced religions that blended African traditions with Christian forms imposed by slaveholders. They ran away, rebelled, and refused to let their spirits be broken, even when their bodies were in chains. Their survival, their creativity, their resistance. These are as much a part of the story of imperialism as the empires themselves. By the end of the 18th century, the world was unrecognizable from what it had been 300 years earlier. European powers controlled vast territories on every inhabited continent. Trade networks spanned the globe, connecting distant peoples in relationships of profound inequality. Wealth accumulated in European capitals while colonies were drained of resources. And the ideologies that justified all of this, racial superiority, manifest destiny, the civilizing mission, had become so deeply embedded in Western thought that they seemed like natural law rather than human invention. The seeds of empire, planted in the age of exploration, had grown into a system that structured the entire world. And as the 19th century approached, that system would reach its terrible peak in the age of high imperialism, when the scramble for dominion would carve up entire continents and leave scars that have never fully healed. The night deepens now, and the first chapter of this long story comes to a gentle close. The explorers have sailed, the conquistadors have conquered, the empires have taken root. But the story is far from over. As you drift towards sleep, let these images settle softly in your mind. The ships on endless oceans, the meeting of worlds, the beginning of a transformation that would reshape humanity itself. Rest now, and when you return, we will walk together through the age when empires reached their zenith, when the world was divided and remade in the image of European power. Until then, let history carry you gently into dreams. The 19th century arrived with the sound of industry. Steam engines hissed and roared in factories that never slept. Railways stretched like iron veins across continents, carrying goods and people at speeds that would have seemed impossible just decades before. Telegraph wires hummed with messages that crossed oceans in minutes rather than months. Europe was transforming, surging forward on waves of technological innovation and industrial might. And this new power demanded resources: coal, rubber, cotton, minerals, land. It demanded markets for the endless stream of manufactured goods pouring from factory floors. It demanded expansion. And so the empires, already established in coastal trading posts and scattered colonies, turned their gaze inward toward the vast interiors of continents they had barely touched. The age of high imperialism had begun, and it would reshape the world more profoundly than anything that had come before. Britain stood at the center of this new imperial age, the undisputed superpower of the 19th century. The British Empire already stretched across the globe: Canada, Australia, India, Caribbean islands, African coastal territories. But it was India that became the jewel in the crown, the colony that defined British imperialism and demonstrated both its ambitions and its contradictions. The British East India Company had spent the 18th century gradually expanding its control through a combination of military conquest, strategic alliances, and political manipulation. By 1857, the company governed vast territories and ruled over hundreds of millions of people. But that year, everything nearly collapsed. Indian soldiers in the company's army, called sepoys, rose in rebellion. The causes were complex: cultural insensitivity, economic exploitation, rumors of cartridges greased with animal fat that violated Hindu and Muslim religious practices. The rebellion spread like wildfire across northern India, and for months, British control hung by a thread. The British response was brutal. Rebels were executed by the thousands, often tied to cannons, and blown apart as a public spectacle meant to terrorize populations into submission. Entire villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were destroyed. When the uprising was finally crushed, the British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India. The British Raj was born, a colonial administration that would rule India for the next 90 years. And with it came a new ideology of imperialism, more paternalistic and more explicitly racist than what had come before. The British portrayed themselves as benevolent rulers bringing order, education, and civilization to peoples incapable of governing themselves. They built railways and telegraph systems, yes, but these were designed to extract resources and maintain control, not to benefit Indians. They established schools that taught English and British history, creating a class of Indians educated in Western ways who could serve as intermediaries between the colonial government and the population. Indigenous systems of governance, education, and justice were dismissed as backward and systematically dismantled. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France was building its own empire with equal ambition. Having lost most of its North American colonies in the 18th century, France turned its attention to Africa and Southeast Asia. In 1830, France invaded Algeria, beginning a conquest that would take decades and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Algeria was not merely colonized, it was designated as an integral part of France itself, and hundreds of thousands of French settlers moved there, seizing the best agricultural land and displacing indigenous populations. In the 1880s, France expanded into Tunisia, then pushed south into West Africa and east into Indochina, establishing colonies in present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French justified their empire through the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, claiming they were spreading French culture, language, and republican values. In reality, they were extracting resources, exploiting labor, and crushing any resistance with military force. But the most dramatic expression of 19th century imperialism came in Africa. For centuries, European presence in Africa had been largely confined to coastal trading posts. The interior remained mysterious to Europeans, protected by geography, disease, and powerful African kingdoms. But by the 1870s, European explorers, missionaries, and traders were penetrating deeper into the continent, mapping rivers, establishing missions, and sending back reports of vast resources waiting to be exploited. King Leopold II of Belgium saw an opportunity. He established the International African Association, ostensibly a humanitarian and scientific organization, but in reality a front for his personal colonial ambitions. Through a combination of deception, manipulation, and ruthless force, Leopold claimed the Congo Basin as his private property, not as a Belgian colony, but as his personal possession. The Congo Free State, as it was called, became a hell on earth. Indigenous populations were enslaved to harvest rubber and ivory. Those who resisted or failed to meet quotas had their hands cut off. Entire villages were burned. It is estimated that between 10 and 15 million Congolese died under Leopold's rule, one of history's greatest atrocities. Leopold's actions in the Congo sparked what became known as the Scramble for Africa. European powers, alarmed by his unilateral claims and eager to secure their own territories, raced to carve up the continent. In 1884, they gathered in Berlin for a conference that would determine Africa's fate without a single African present. They drew borders with rulers and pencils, slicing through kingdoms, dividing ethnic groups, grouping together peoples with different languages and traditions. The map of Africa they created had nothing to do with African realities and everything to do with European competition. Within 2 decades, virtually the entire continent had been claimed. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. Millions of Africans found themselves subjects of foreign empires, their lives dictated by distant capitals, their resources extracted to fuel European industry, their labor coerced to build the infrastructure of their own subjugation. The speed at which Africa was partitioned remains staggering even now, more than a century later. In 1870, European powers controlled roughly 10% of the African continent. By 1914, they controlled over 90%. This was not gradual expansion, it was a frenzy driven by industrial competition, nationalist pride, and the fear of being left behind. Germany, newly unified in 1871, arrived late to the imperial game and aggressively pursued colonies in Africa to prove itself a great power. The Germans established colonies in present-day Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo. In Namibia, when the Herero and Nama peoples resisted German occupation, the colonial authorities responded with genocidal violence. Tens of thousands were driven into the desert to die of thirst. Concentration camps were established where survivors were worked to death. It was a preview of horrors that Europe would later inflict upon itself, but here in Africa, far from European eyes, the world barely noticed or cared. Italy too sought its place in the sun, attempting to carve out an empire in East Africa. The Italians colonized Eritrea and Somalia, then set their sights on Ethiopia, one of Africa's oldest Christian kingdoms, and one of the few regions that had successfully resisted European penetration. In 1896, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia, confident of easy victory. They were wrong. At the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II decisively defeated the Italians, killing thousands and forcing Italy to recognize Ethiopian independence. It was a rare African victory against European imperialism, a moment of pride that resonated across the colonized world. Ethiopia would remain independent until Mussolini's Italy invaded again in 1935, desperate to avenge the humiliation of Adwa and prove fascist Italy's strength. Britain and France, already possessing vast empires, competed to expand their African territories even further. Britain pursued a vision of continuous territory from Cairo to Cape Town, a ribbon of red on the map connecting its holdings in Egypt to its possessions in southern Africa. France dreamed of an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, from Algeria across the Sahara to French possessions in West and Central Africa. These visions collided in 1898 at Fashoda, a remote outpost in present-day South Sudan, where British and French expeditions met face to face. For weeks, the two powers teetered on the brink of war. Eventually, France backed down, recognizing that Britain's naval superiority made conflict too dangerous. But the incident revealed how seriously European powers took their imperial ambitions. They were willing to go to war with each other over stretches of African land that most Europeans could not even locate on a map. In Asia, the pattern repeated with local variations. The Dutch tightened their grip on the Indonesian archipelago, transforming the Dutch East Indies into one of the world's most profitable colonies through the forced cultivation of cash crops like coffee, sugar, and rubber. The French solidified control over Indochina, building a colonial administration that extracted rice, rubber, and minerals while suppressing Vietnamese, Lao, and Cambodian culture and autonomy. The British expanded their influence in Burma, Malaya, and beyond, always seeking to protect the approaches to India and secure resources for their growing industrial economy. Even the United States, having declared its independence from colonial rule just over a century earlier, joined the Imperial Club. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States took control of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, claiming it was spreading democracy and civilization while brutally suppressing Filipino independence movements that had been fighting Spanish rule and had no desire to simply trade one colonial master for another. And then there was China, too large and too complex to be fully colonized, but subjected to a different form of imperial domination. After Britain defeated China in the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century, wars fought explicitly to force China to accept British opium imports, European powers and Japan carved China into spheres of influence. Treaty ports were established where foreign powers governed autonomous enclaves, exempt from Chinese law. Massive indemnities were extracted after every conflict, draining China's treasury. Railways, mines, and industries fell under foreign control. China remained nominally independent, but its sovereignty was hollowed out, its government unable to resist foreign demands backed by superior military force. The humiliation China suffered during this century of subjugation would shape Chinese nationalism and foreign policy for generations to come. By the early 20th century, the world had been divided. The great empires had reached their maximum extent, controlling the fates of hundreds of millions of people who had never consented to their rule and had no voice in the governments that dictated their lives. The sun never set on the British Empire because it spanned every time zone. France governed territories 50 times larger than France itself. Even smaller European nations like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Portugal controlled colonial possessions vastly larger and more populous than their homelands. It was a world order built on racial hierarchy, military dominance, and economic extraction, and it was defended by an ideology that insisted this was not only acceptable, but necessary, even noble. The colonizers convinced themselves they were bringing progress to backward peoples, light to darkness, order to chaos. They built monuments to this belief, grand colonial buildings, statues of conquering heroes, museums filled with artifacts, stripped from colonized lands and displayed as trophies. They wrote history books that celebrated imperial expansion as the march of civilization. And for a time, it seemed as if this order might last forever. But empires, no matter how powerful, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. And as the 20th century unfolded, those seeds would begin to sprout in unexpected places, nourished by resistance, by new ideas of freedom and self-determination, by the very contradictions imperialism created. The age of empires had reached its zenith. What came next would be its long, painful collapse. Yet even at the height of empire, cracks were visible to those willing to see them. Resistance had never stopped. In every colony, in every occupied territory, people found ways to push back against their subjugation. Sometimes resistance was violent, uprisings, rebellions, guerrilla campaigns that tied down colonial armies and drained imperial treasuries. Other times it was quiet. The preservation of languages forbidden by colonial authorities, the practice of religions banned as primitive, the telling of stories that remembered a time before the empire arrived. Indigenous leaders navigated impossible situations, some collaborating with colonial powers to protect what little autonomy they could, others leading movements of resistance that became legends. The empires liked to portray their rule as inevitable and their subjects as passive or grateful, but the truth was messier, more contested, more human. In India, opposition to British rule grew steadily throughout the 19th century. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, began as a modest organization of English-educated Indians seeking modest reforms. But over time, as British promises of representation and partnership proved hollow, the Congress radicalized. By the early 20th century, Indian nationalists were calling not for reform, but for independence, for Swaraj, self-rule. Leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak argued that freedom was India's birthright. Protests erupted across the country. British authorities responded with repression, imprisoning leaders, censoring newspapers, banning public gatherings. But each act of repression only strengthened the independence movement, creating martyrs and deepening resentment against foreign rule. In Africa, resistance took many forms depending on local circumstances. Some kingdoms fought pitched battles against European invaders, like the Zulu against the British in southern Africa, or the Ashanti against the British in West Africa. These wars were often heroic, but ultimately doomed. European military technology, particularly the Maxim machine gun, gave colonial armies overwhelming firepower advantages. But even after formal military resistance was crushed, other forms of opposition continued. People refused to work on colonial plantations. They migrated away from areas under direct colonial control. They engaged in what historian James Scott called weapons of the weak, small acts of defiance that, multiplied across millions of people, made colonial governance difficult and expensive. The empires could conquer, but they could never fully control. In Southeast Asia, resistance movements blended traditional forms of authority with new ideologies imported from Europe and adapted to local circumstances. Vietnamese intellectuals studied in France, where they encountered ideas of republicanism, socialism, and nationalism. They returned home determined to apply these ideas to the struggle against French colonialism. Secret societies formed, organizing protests, printing underground newspapers, planning uprisings. The French responded with surveillance, arrests, and executions, but they could not stamp out the desire for independence. Similar patterns emerged across the colonized world. Western education, intended to create compliant colonial subjects, instead created a generation of leaders who turned Western ideas of freedom and equality against the empires that ruled them. The economic contradictions of imperialism also began to show. Colonies were supposed to enrich the mother country, but maintaining them required enormous expenditures on military forces, colonial administrations, and infrastructure. Britain spent vast sums defending its empire against external threats and internal rebellions. France's colonial wars drained its treasury. And as colonies industrialized slightly, producing some goods locally rather than importing everything from Europe, they became economic competitors rather than captive markets. The simple mercantilist logic that had justified early imperialism, extract raw materials, sell manufactured goods, grew more complicated as colonized peoples demanded fair wages, better working conditions, and a share of the wealth their labor created. Strikes erupted on plantations and in mines. Labor movements organized across colonial territories. The empire was supposed to be about order and profit, but it was generating chaos and cost. Then came the First World War, and everything changed. The European powers, locked in imperial competition and tangled in alliance systems, stumbled into a catastrophic conflict that would kill millions and shatter the old certainties. And they dragged their empires with them. Indian soldiers fought in the trenches of France and the deserts of Mesopotamia. African soldiers served in Europe and in campaigns across their own continent. Vietnamese, Algerian, Caribbean troops, all were mobilized to fight in a European war that had nothing to do with them. Colonial subjects were promised that their loyalty and sacrifice would be rewarded with greater autonomy, perhaps even independence. They believed these promises. They fought bravely, died in staggering numbers, and when the war ended, they expected change. But the empires had no intention of keeping their promises. When the war ended in 1918, the victorious powers divided the defeated German and Ottoman empires among themselves, creating new colonies disguised as League of Nations mandates. Britain and France carved up the Middle East, drawing borders that ignored ethnic and religious realities, installing puppet monarchs, and securing access to the region's newly discovered oil reserves. The betrayal was complete and obvious to everyone who had believed in wartime promises, and so the seeds of resistance already planted began to grow more vigorously. The age of empires had reached its peak, but the descent had begun. The colonized world had been changed by the war, exposed to new ideas, given new tools for organization and resistance, and they would not forget what they had been promised, or what they had been denied. The long struggle for decolonization was beginning, though few yet realized how completely it would transform the world. As this chapter closes, let these images rest gently in your mind, the maps redrawn by distant powers, the millions of lives reshaped by decisions made in foreign capitals, the quiet acts of resistance that accumulated like drops of water, slowly wearing away stone. Sleep now, knowing that empires, no matter how vast, are built and maintained by human choices. And what humans build, humans can also unmake. We will continue this journey together, but for now, rest. Conquest was the dramatic beginning, but governance was the daily reality. To hold an empire required more than military force. It required systems, bureaucracies, institutions that could reach into the lives of millions and reshape them from within. The empires understood this instinctively. They knew that soldiers could occupy territory, but only administration could truly control it. And so they built elaborate machinery of governance, vast networks of officials, laws, schools, and policies designed not just to extract wealth, but to transform the very souls of colonized peoples. This was imperialism's most insidious work. Not the violence of conquest, which at least was visible and could be resisted, but the quiet, systematic remaking of societies until the colonized themselves internalized the empire's values and forgot who they had been before. The British perfected this art in India, where they governed hundreds of millions through a relatively small number of British officials, supported by a much larger number of Indian intermediaries. The Indian civil service became the backbone of colonial administration, an elite bureaucracy that managed everything from tax collection to justice to public works. To join the ICS, Indians had to pass examinations conducted in English, testing knowledge of British history, literature, and law. The exams were deliberately designed to favor those educated in British-style schools, creating a class of Indians who thought, spoke, and often identified more with their British rulers than with their own people. These were the intermediaries who made empire possible: translators, clerks, policemen, judges, people who stood between the colonial state and the population, implementing policies they had no role in creating. The education system was the empire's most powerful tool for reshaping minds. Before colonialism, India had its own educational traditions: gurukuls, where students lived with teachers and learned Sanskrit, philosophy, and traditional sciences; madrasas, where Islamic scholarship flourished; village schools, where practical knowledge was passed down through generations. The British systematically dismantled these institutions, replacing them with schools modelled on British education. Lord Macaulay, in his infamous 1835 Minute on Education, stated the goal explicitly: to create a class of persons Indian in blood and colour, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Indigenous languages were dismissed as inadequate for modern knowledge. Students were taught that their own histories were tales of superstition and backwardness, that civilization began with European contact, that their salvation lay in adopting British ways. Entire generations grew up ashamed of their own cultures, desperate to prove themselves worthy in the eyes of their colonizers. The French took a similar but distinct approach in their colonies. The policy of assimilation held that Africans and Asians could, through proper French education and adoption of French culture, become civilized, though never quite equal to the French themselves. Schools in French colonies taught African and Asian children to recite our ancestors the Gauls, erasing their own histories and replacing them with French national mythology. The French language was imposed as the medium of instruction and administration. Indigenous languages were forbidden in schools, sometimes punished with beatings. The message was clear: to succeed in the colonial world, you must stop being yourself and become a pale imitation of your rulers. Some colonized subjects embraced this path, seeing it as the only route to advancement. Others resisted quietly, speaking their own languages at home, preserving stories and traditions away from colonial eyes, maintaining a dual existence, one face for the empire, another for themselves. Legal systems were another instrument of control. Colonial powers imposed European legal codes that often conflicted with indigenous systems of justice and social organization. In Africa, British indirect rule supposedly preserved traditional authorities, but in reality, chiefs and kings became agents of the colonial state. Their authority derived not from their people, but from British recognition. They were expected to enforce colonial policies, collecting taxes, recruiting labor, maintaining order, even when these policies contradicted local customs and values. Those who refused were replaced. Those who complied were rewarded with privileges, but often lost legitimacy in the eyes of their people, caught in an impossible position between colonial demands and community expectations. The empires also used law to entrench racial hierarchies. In colonies throughout Africa and Asia, different legal codes applied to Europeans and indigenous peoples. Europeans could not be tried in indigenous courts. They enjoyed privileges and protections denied to the colonized. In South Africa, the British and later the Afrikaners developed increasingly elaborate systems of racial segregation that would eventually crystallize into apartheid. In the American colonies and later the United States, laws codified slavery, and then, after emancipation, segregation and disenfranchisement. These were not aberrations or excesses, they were fundamental to how empire worked. Empire required racial hierarchy to justify itself, and law was one of the primary means of creating and maintaining that hierarchy. Alongside education and law, imperial powers wielded cultural influence with quiet persistence, seeking to reconstruct colonized societies in their own image. Architecture in colonial cities became a symbol of this transformation. Grand government buildings, train stations, and boulevards were constructed to mirror those of London, Paris, or Amsterdam. Public spaces, renamed with European titles, signaled the shift in power and identity. Statues of monarchs and colonial governors rose over city squares, casting literal and metaphorical shadows on the daily lives of their subjects. Even timekeeping was transformed as European calendars replaced traditional systems, and clocks imported from the metropole dictated the rhythm of colonial life. Religion, too, became an arena for the machinery of control. Missionaries followed traders and soldiers, establishing churches and schools that doubled as instruments of cultural assimilation. While some missionaries provided critical social services, offering education and healthcare, many saw their work as a civilizing mission, erasing indigenous beliefs and spiritual practices in favor of Christianity. In some regions, conversion brought certain advantages: access to education, political patronage, or legal privileges. Yet this came at the cost of profound alienation from traditional ways. The suppression of local faiths and rituals reinforced the sense of loss and disconnection as communities found themselves navigating the tension between old and new identities. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the machinery of empire was the transformation of economic life. Railways sliced through jungles and deserts, not to connect local people, but to extract resources and transport them to distant ports. Agriculture was reorganized to favor cash crops destined for export: cotton, cocoa, tea, and rubber, often replacing subsistence farming and creating new dependencies. Local crafts, industries, and economic systems were destabilized, leaving populations increasingly reliant on foreign markets subject to sudden booms and busts. Colonial governments imposed taxes to compel participation in this new economy, forcing people to abandon traditional livelihoods and enter wage labor under often brutal conditions. Yet, for all their efforts, empires never encountered total success in their project of transformation. Beneath the surface of compliance, resistance endured. In homes, families spoke their ancestral languages, told old stories, and celebrated forbidden festivals in quiet defiance. Secret societies, underground schools, and indigenous religious movements kept alternate histories alive. Even as colonial power seemed overwhelming, the memory of the world before empire flickered in hearts and minds, preserved and passed on in ways both subtle and profound. In this delicate interplay between domination and resilience, erasure and remembrance, the machinery of empire revealed both its power and its limits. The tools of control could reshape societies, but they could never wholly extinguish the urge for autonomy, the pride in identity, or the longing to reclaim lost worlds. As the machinery ground on, the seeds of change were being sown, quietly nurturing the resistance and hope that would one day challenge the empire's reach. Now, as this chapter's gentle tide ebbs and you settle deeper into the comfort of night, consider how power often works not with thunder, but with persistent, whispering hands. The world was being remade, but memory endured in dream and story, waiting for its moment to return. Behind every statistic, every border drawn on a map, every proclamation issued from a distant capital, there were people. Mothers and fathers, children and elders, families with roots stretching back centuries, communities woven together by language, tradition, and shared memory. These were not abstractions or numbers in colonial ledgers. They were human beings whose lives were upended, whose futures were stolen, whose pain was real and immediate. This chapter turns away from the grand narratives of empire and toward the lived experiences of those who endured its weight. Here we meet the voices that history too often forgets: the enslaved, the displaced, the tortured, the murdered, but also the resistors, the survivors, the ones who refused to surrender their dignity even when everything else was taken. These stories are heavy, yes, but they are essential. They remind us that imperialism was not an abstract historical process. It was a daily reality of suffering and struggle, of loss and resilience. In the Caribbean sugar plantations, enslaved Africans worked from sunrise to sunset under conditions designed to extract maximum labor while denying maximum humanity. The work was backbreaking, cutting sugarcane under tropical sun, feeding it into mills that could crush limbs as easily as stalks, boiling the juice in cauldrons that scalded flesh. Overseers patrolled with whips, and punishments for perceived laziness or defiance were brutal and public, meant to terrorize entire populations into submission. Families were torn apart at the auction block, children sold away from parents, husbands separated from wives, bonds of love severed by the logic of profit. Yet even in this hell, enslaved peoples created community, found ways to love, to celebrate, to resist. They sang songs that carried coded messages about escape routes. They practiced religions that blended African traditions with Christian forms, creating spiritual spaces where they could be free, even when their bodies were in chains. And they ran. Maroon communities, settlements of escaped slaves, formed in mountains and swamps throughout the Americas, places where colonial authorities could not easily reach. These communities became beacons of freedom, proving that escape was possible, that another way of living existed beyond the plantation. Some Maroons raided plantations, liberating others and disrupting the economy of slavery. Colonial powers sent military expeditions to destroy these communities, but many survived for decades, even centuries, maintaining their autonomy through a combination of military resistance, strategic alliances, and intimate knowledge of terrain their pursuers could not navigate. The most successful slave rebellion in history occurred in Haiti, then the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean due to its sugar and coffee plantations worked by hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. In 1791, inspired by the French Revolution's rhetoric of liberty and equality, enslaved peoples rose in rebellion. What began as a revolt became a 13-year war of liberation. The rebels, led eventually by Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines, defeated not only French colonial forces but also Spanish and British armies that attempted to exploit the chaos. In 1804, Haiti declared independence, becoming the first black republic in the world and the only nation born from a successful slave rebellion. It was a moment of extraordinary hope, proof that enslaved peoples could defeat the mightiest empires and claim their freedom. But the world punished Haiti for this audacity. France demanded massive reparations for the loss of property, meaning the enslaved people who had freed themselves, and Haiti, isolated and threatened with military intervention, agreed to pay. The debt crippled Haiti's economy for more than a century, ensuring that the nation born in the fires of liberation would struggle in poverty, its wealth extracted not by formal colonialism, but by financial mechanisms that served the same purpose. Other slaveholding societies watched Haiti with terror and implemented even harsher controls, fearful that rebellion might spread. Yet Haiti's example inspired enslaved and oppressed peoples throughout the Americas and beyond, proving that empire was not invincible, that freedom could be seized by those determined enough to fight for it. In Africa, resistance took countless forms. In Algeria, Abd al-Qadir led a 17-year struggle against French colonization, creating a mobile state that retreated before French advances and struck back when opportunities arose. He was eventually defeated and exiled, but his resistance inspired generations of Algerians and delayed full French control for decades. In West Africa, Samurai Touré built a powerful state that resisted French expansion for nearly 20 years, employing guerrilla tactics and even manufacturing weapons locally to counter European technological advantages. In southern Africa, the Zulu kingdom under leaders like Cetshwayo fought British imperial expansion with sophisticated military tactics that initially stunned colonial forces. At the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, Zulu warriors annihilated a British column, one of the most shocking defeats in British imperial history. Though the Zulu were eventually subdued through overwhelming force and scorched earth tactics, their resistance demonstrated that African peoples were not passive victims but active agents in their own histories. In Kenya during the 1950s, the Mau Mau uprising challenged British colonial rule with a ferocity that shook the empire to its core. The roots of the rebellion lay in land dispossession. British settlers had seized the most fertile lands in the highlands, forcing the Kikuyu people onto increasingly crowded reserves where they struggled to survive. Frustration built for decades until it exploded into armed resistance. Mau Mau fighters, operating from bases in the forests, attacked colonial targets and those they viewed as collaborators. The British response was brutal beyond measure. They declared a state of emergency, rounded up hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu, and detained them in concentration camps where torture, starvation, and execution were routine. Entire villages were destroyed. Collective punishments were imposed on communities suspected of harboring rebels. The official death toll was in the tens of thousands, but the true number was likely far higher. Yet the Mau Mau resistance succeeded in making Kenya ungovernable at acceptable cost, hastening British withdrawal and Kenya's path to independence. In India, resistance to British rule evolved from armed rebellions to sophisticated non-violent movements that would eventually bring down the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Mohandas Gandhi returned to India from South Africa in 1915, bringing with him a philosophy of satyagraha, truth force, or non-violent resistance. Gandhi understood that the British Empire relied not just on military might, but on the cooperation, however coerced, of millions of Indians. If that cooperation could be withdrawn, if Indians could resist without violence, they could expose the moral bankruptcy of colonial rule and make governance impossible. He organized campaigns of civil disobedience, mass refusal to obey unjust laws, boycotts of British goods, peaceful protests that filled jails with thousands willing to suffer for freedom. The Salt March of 1930 became the defining moment of this strategy. British law monopolized salt production, taxing a necessity that every Indian needed. Gandhi announced he would march to the sea and make salt illegally, a simple act of defiance with profound symbolic power. He walked for 24 days, gathering followers as he went, until thousands reached the Arabian Sea, where Gandhi ceremonially picked up a handful of salt. Across India, millions followed his example, making salt, breaking the law, inviting arrest. British authorities imprisoned over 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. The brutality of the British response, police beating peaceful protesters, filling jails beyond capacity, was documented by international journalists and horrified the world. The empire's claim to be a civilizing force became harder to defend when its agents beat unarmed men and women for the crime of making salt. Yet non-violence came with costs that are sometimes forgotten. Thousands were beaten, imprisoned, or killed during these campaigns. Families were shattered by arrests and economic hardship from boycotts. And not all Indians agreed with Gandhi's methods. Some argued that only armed resistance could defeat armed empire, that moral victories meant nothing if independence never came. These tensions within the independence movement reflected deeper questions about how to resist oppression, questions that occupied colonized peoples everywhere and had no easy answers. In Vietnam, resistance to French colonialism simmered for decades before exploding into full-scale war. The Vietnamese had never accepted French rule, and revolutionary movements organized continuously despite brutal French repression. Ho Chi Minh, educated in France and influenced by communist ideology, founded the Viet Minh in 1941 to fight for independence. When World War II ended and France attempted to reassert colonial control, the Viet Minh launched a war of liberation that would last 9 years. The fighting was savage. French forces used napalm and conducted mass executions of suspected rebels, while the Viet Minh employed guerrilla tactics and built support among rural populations. The war culminated in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, where Viet Minh forces besieged and defeated a French garrison in a battle that shocked the world. France withdrew, Vietnam was temporarily divided, and though peace did not last, America would soon take France's place. The message was clear: colonial empires could be defeated by determined peoples fighting for their homeland. Across the colonized world, similar stories unfolded, some ending in triumph, others in tragedy, most containing elements of both. In the Philippines, guerrilla fighters resisted American occupation for years after the Spanish-American War, with American forces responding through tactics that included torture, concentration camps, and the killing of civilians. In Indonesia, nationalist movements challenged Dutch rule through armed resistance and political organization, eventually winning independence after World War II weakened European powers. In the Middle East, Arab peoples who had been promised independence for supporting Britain against the Ottoman Empire found themselves under British and French mandates instead, sparking resistance movements that would shape the region for generations. These stories of resistance remind us that imperialism was contested at every turn, that the colonized were never passive victims, but active participants in their own histories. They organized, they fought, they sacrificed, they endured. Some lived to see freedom. Many did not. But their struggles mattered, their courage mattered, their refusal to accept subjugation mattered. They proved that empire, for all its power, could not extinguish the human desire for dignity, autonomy, and justice. And as you listen to these stories in the quiet of night, let them settle into your heart, not as tales of distant suffering, but as testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming power. But resistance was not always dramatic or visible. For every armed rebellion or mass movement, there were countless small acts of defiance that kept hope alive and preserved identity in the face of erasure. In schools where indigenous languages were forbidden, children whispered to each other in their mother tongues when teachers weren't listening, keeping sounds and words alive that colonial authorities tried to kill. In homes, grandparents told stories of ancestors and heroes from before the empire came, ensuring that children knew they belonged to histories deeper and richer than what textbooks taught. In markets and villages, people continued practicing traditional crafts, celebrating festivals, and maintaining social structures that colonial law tried to replace. These acts seemed small compared to wars and revolutions, but they were essential. They were how cultures survived, how memory persisted, how people maintained their humanity when systems were designed to strip it away. Women, often invisible in traditional histories of resistance, played crucial roles that historians are only now beginning to fully recognize. In Algeria, women served as couriers and fighters in the independence movement, moving freely through French checkpoints where men would have been stopped and searched. In India, women joined Gandhi's campaigns in enormous numbers, defying both colonial authorities and traditional expectations about women's proper roles. They picketed liquor shops, participated in salt marches, went to prison by the thousands. Their participation transformed both the independence movement and Indian society itself, challenging patriarchal structures even as they fought colonial ones. In Kenya, women sustained Mau Mau fighters in the forests, smuggling food and supplies past British patrols. Many were detained, tortured, and killed for their roles, yet their contributions were often minimized or forgotten in official histories written after independence. The cultural resistance that emerged from colonialism produced some of humanity's most powerful art and literature. Enslaved Africans in the Americas created musical forms, spirituals, blues, jazz, that expressed pain and hope in ways that transcended words, that created beauty from suffering and defiance from despair. These musical traditions would eventually transform global culture, but they began as survival mechanisms, ways of processing trauma and maintaining community under conditions designed to destroy both. In the 20th century, writers from colonized societies began producing literature that challenged imperial narratives and reclaimed their own stories. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart showed the Igbo world before colonialism with complexity and dignity, countering European depictions of Africa as savage and primitive. Aimé Césaire's poetry and essays articulated negritude, a celebration of black identity and culture in defiance of colonial racism. Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist from Martinique who joined Algeria's independence struggle, wrote searing analyses of colonialism's psychological damage and the necessity of decolonization. These writers and artists became voices for millions who had been silenced, creating counter-narratives that challenged empire's claim to speak for those it ruled. Yet we must also acknowledge the complex legacies of survival under empire. Not everyone resisted. Some colonized peoples collaborated with imperial powers, serving in colonial administrations, armies, and police forces. Their motivations varied. Some sought advantages within the colonial system, others genuinely believed in the civilizing mission. Still others had little choice if they wanted to feed their families. After independence, these collaborators often faced retribution, sometimes justified, sometimes excessive. But their existence reminds us that colonialism created impossible situations where survival sometimes required compromise. where the lines between resistance and collaboration were not always clear, where ordinary people made difficult choices with limited options. The trauma of colonialism did not end with political independence. Generations lived with wounds that could not be easily healed. The loss of languages, the disruption of social structures, the internalization of racist ideologies that taught colonized peoples to see themselves as inferior. Families were separated, communities displaced, entire ways of life destroyed. The psychological damage was profound and lasting. Even today, descendants of colonized peoples grapple with questions of identity, belonging, and worth that have roots in imperial violence. Recognizing this ongoing trauma is not about dwelling in victimhood. It is about understanding how history shapes the present, how past injustices cast long shadows, how healing requires acknowledging wounds. And yet, through all the suffering, through all the loss, peoples survived. They adapted, they rebuilt, they found ways to carry on. They preserved pieces of their cultures and created new forms by blending old traditions with new realities. They raised children and told them stories and taught them to be proud of who they were. They organized communities and supported each other through hardship. They dreamed of freedom and worked toward it, even when it seemed impossibly distant. This capacity for survival, for finding joy and meaning even in the darkest circumstances, is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the human response to imperialism. It speaks to something essential in the human spirit, a refusal to be entirely conquered, a determination to maintain dignity regardless of circumstances, a hope that persists even when reason suggests it should not. As this chapter draws to a gentle close, let these stories of suffering and survival settle over you like a prayer. Remember that behind every historical abstraction were individuals who loved and feared, who hoped and struggled, who died and endured. Their pain was real, their resistance was real, their humanity was real. And as you drift towards sleep, carry with you the knowledge that even in history's darkest chapters, people found ways to resist, to survive, to maintain their essential humanity. Rest now, knowing that the story continues, that from resistance and survival came the long struggle for liberation that would finally begin to dismantle the empires that seemed eternal. Tomorrow we journey toward that transformation, but tonight, simply rest. No empire lasts forever. This truth, written in the ruins of Rome and Persia of the Mongols and the Ottomans, would be written once more in the 20th century as the great European empires that had carved up the world began their long, painful collapse. The process was neither simple nor inevitable. It was forced into being by colonized peoples who refused to remain subjects by global wars that drained imperial powers, by new ideologies that made old justifications untenable, and by economic realities that turned colonies from assets into burdens. Between 1945 and 1975, the map of the world was redrawn once more, this time by those who had been colonized. Dozens of new nations emerged, flags were raised, anthems sung, and millions celebrated independence. But liberation was rarely clean or complete. The departing empires left behind borders that made no sense, economies structured to serve foreign interests, and deep scars that would shape these new nations for generations. This is the story of how empires fell and what rose imperfectly from their ashes. The Second World War was the catalyst that made decolonization inevitable. European powers exhausted themselves fighting each other, their economies shattered, their moral authority demolished. Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands all emerged from the war weakened, dependent on American aid, unable to maintain the vast military and administrative apparatus that empire required. Meanwhile, colonized peoples who had fought in the war returned home, transformed. They had seen their supposed masters defeated, had witnessed European cities in ruins, had been exposed to ideas of democracy and self-determination that the Allies claimed to be fighting for. They asked the obvious question, if we fought for freedom in Europe, why should we not have freedom at home? The empires had no good answer, and their attempts to maintain control through force became increasingly desperate and brutal. India was the first domino to fall, and its independence sent shockwaves through the colonial world. The Indian independence movement, led by figures like Gandhi, Nehru, and countless others, had made British rule untenable through decades of mass mobilization, civil disobedience, and political pressure. After the war, Britain simply lacked the resources and will to continue holding India against the determined opposition of hundreds of millions. In 1947, Britain granted independence, but the withdrawal was rushed and catastrophic. The British drew partition lines dividing India from the new Muslim state of Pakistan, lines that split communities and ignored local realities. The result was one of history's greatest human catastrophes. Communal violence erupted as Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs fled across new borders, trying to reach what they hoped would be safety. Between 1 and 2 million people were killed. 10 to 20 million were displaced. Families were torn apart. Cities burned. It was independence, yes, but independence born in blood and trauma that would poison relations between India and Pakistan for generations. Yet, despite the horror of partition, Indian independence was a watershed moment. It proved that even the mightiest empire could be forced to withdraw, that colonized peoples could win their freedom. Across Asia and Africa, independence movements took heart. In Indonesia, nationalists who had declared independence in 1945 fought a 4-year war against the Dutch, who attempted to reassert colonial control after the Japanese occupation ended. The Dutch, already weakened by the war and facing international pressure, eventually withdrew in 1949. Indonesia was free, though the new nation faced enormous challenges, building a unified state from hundreds of ethnic groups spread across thousands of islands, all while dealing with the economic and social damage of centuries of exploitation. In Indochina, France refused to accept the end of empire. When Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence in 1945, France responded with military force, attempting to reclaim its colony. The result was a brutal 9-year war that ended with France's humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Vietnam was temporarily divided with the promise of elections to reunify the country. Those elections never happened. America, fearing communist expansion, supported a government in South Vietnam and would eventually take France's place, leading to another 2 decades of devastating war. But France's defeat in 1954 made clear that European powers could no longer hold Asian colonies by force, not when colonized peoples were willing to fight wars of national liberation with the determination and sacrifice that the Vietnamese had shown. Africa's turn came in the late 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s in what became known as the Wind of Change. Ghana led the way in 1957, becoming the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, who had organized mass movements demanding self-rule. His success inspired the entire continent. Over the next decade, dozens of African colonies achieved independence, sometimes peacefully, often through armed struggle. The process varied dramatically depending on local circumstances and the colonizing power involved. Britain, recognizing the inevitability of decolonization and hoping to maintain influence through the Commonwealth, generally negotiated independence with relatively less violence than other powers. Throughout the 1960s, British colonies in Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia became independent nations. The transitions were not always smooth. Kenya's path to independence was stained by the Mau Mau uprising and Britain's brutal response. In Rhodesia, white settlers unilaterally declared independence rather than accept majority rule, leading to years of guerrilla war before Zimbabwe finally achieved true independence in 1980. But compared to what happened in French and Portuguese colonies, British decolonization in Africa was relatively orderly, though it left behind all the problems inherent in colonial borders and economic structures. France clung to empire more desperately, viewing its colonies as integral to French greatness and global power. After losing Indochina, France was determined not to lose Algeria, which had been legally classified as part of France itself and was home to over 1 million European settlers. When Algerian nationalists launched a war of independence in 1954, France responded with overwhelming force. The Algerian War became one of decolonization's bloodiest conflicts. Torture was systematic, villages were destroyed, hundreds of thousands died. The war nearly tore France apart, leading to a political crisis that brought Charles de Gaulle to power. Even de Gaulle eventually recognized that Algeria could not be held, and in 1962, after 8 years of war, Algeria won its independence. The war's brutality left wounds on both sides that have never fully healed, shaping French and Algerian politics and relations for decades. Portugal, Europe's poorest country ruled by a fascist dictatorship, held on to its African colonies longest of all. Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau fought wars of liberation throughout the 1960s and early 1970s against Portuguese forces determined to maintain empire. These were not quick wars, they dragged on year after year, draining Portugal's economy and army. The wars became increasingly unpopular in Portugal itself, and in 1974 Portuguese military officers, tired of fighting unwinnable colonial wars, overthrew the dictatorship. The new government immediately began negotiations, and by 1975, Portugal's African colonies were independent. But independence came to nations devastated by years of war, with little infrastructure and economies in ruins. And in Angola and Mozambique, independence immediately gave way to civil wars as different factions, backed by Cold War superpowers, fought for control. For the departing empires left behind time bombs that would detonate for years. The borders they had drawn split ethnic groups and lumped together peoples with different languages, religions and histories. Nigeria inherited borders that combined over 250 ethnic groups, leading to tensions that exploded into civil war just years after independence. Rwanda and Burundi were left with colonial classifications of Hutu and Tutsi that had been artificial and fluid, but were now rigidified into ethnic identities that would fuel genocidal violence. In the Middle East, British and French Mandate borders created nations like Iraq and Syria that contained fractious populations, setting the stage for decades of instability. Economic independence proved even harder to achieve than political independence. Colonial economies had been structured to extract raw materials and import manufactured goods, creating dependencies that did not vanish with independence. New nations found themselves still relying on former colonizers for trade, technology, and capital. They inherited debt, inadequate infrastructure, and few industries. Attempts at rapid industrialization and economic development often failed or created new problems: corruption, inefficiency, environmental damage. International financial institutions dominated by former colonial powers imposed conditions on loans that limited sovereignty and perpetuated inequality. Political independence, hard-won and precious, often felt hollow when economic power remained in foreign hands. The Cold War complicated everything. The United States and Soviet Union, competing for global influence, turned newly independent nations into battlegrounds. They supported friendly governments and armed opposition movements, caring little for the wishes of local populations. Elected leaders who pursued policies Washington or Moscow disliked were overthrown in coups. Civil wars were prolonged by external support for both sides. The Congo's democratically elected leader, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated with Western complicity because of fears he might align with the Soviet Union. In Indonesia, a military coup in 1965 led to mass killings of suspected communists, with American support. In Angola and Mozambique, Cold War proxy wars killed hundreds of thousands and destroyed infrastructure. Independence had been won, but true autonomy remained elusive when superpowers treated the world as their chessboard. Yet there were also moments of genuine hope and achievement. Leaders like Tanzania's Julius Nyerere pursued visions of African socialism, emphasizing education, healthcare, and rural development over rapid industrialization. India, despite poverty and challenges, maintained democratic governance and built institutions that would eventually help it become a major power. Some nations, Singapore, South Korea, later Botswana, achieved remarkable economic development, though often through authoritarian means and special circumstances. Cultural renaissance occurred across the formerly colonized world as artists, writers, and musicians explored post-colonial identities, creating new forms that blended indigenous traditions with global influences. The very fact of independence mattered. Flags, anthems, seats at the United Nations, the dignity of self-governance even when that governance was imperfect. By the mid-1970s, formal empire was essentially over. The Portuguese colonies were the last to gain independence. A few remnants remained. Hong Kong would not return to China until 1997, but the age when European powers controlled vast territories had ended. The world map showed dozens of new nations where colonies had been. Billions of people had moved from being subjects to being citizens, from being ruled by distant powers to governing themselves. It was an extraordinary transformation, one of the most significant in human history. Yet it was not the clean break that many had hoped for. The shadows of empire stretched long, and the next chapter of history would be shaped by how new nations navigated the complex legacies they had inherited. As the dust of decolonization settled, new nations faced the monumental task of building themselves from the fragments empire had left behind. Independence meant the right to self-governance, but it did not automatically bring unity, prosperity, or peace. Many new nations were artificial creations, their borders drawn by colonial powers with no regard for ethnic, linguistic, or religious realities. Nigeria combined over 250 distinct ethnic groups within borders designed by Britain for administrative convenience. The Democratic Republic of Congo inherited borders encompassing hundreds of different peoples who had never seen themselves as part of a single nation. These arbitrary boundaries became sources of conflict that persist to this day as groups competed for power and resources within states that had no organic coherence. Leadership proved another challenge. Colonial powers had deliberately prevented the development of indigenous political leadership and technical expertise, fearing it would threaten their control. When independence came, new nations often lacked experienced administrators, trained professionals, and established institutions. Some independence leaders rose brilliantly to the challenge: Nehru in India, Nyerere in Tanzania, Senghor in Senegal, building institutions and pursuing visions of national development despite enormous obstacles. Others proved less capable or more interested in personal power than national welfare. Military coups became common as armies, often the most organized institutions in new nations, seized power from civilian governments they viewed as corrupt or ineffective. The Cold War superpowers actively destabilized many newly independent nations, viewing them not as sovereign states deserving respect, but as pieces in their global competition. When leaders pursued policies of non-alignment or socialism, Western powers often responded with covert action to remove them. Coups, assassinations, and support for rebel movements became tools of foreign policy. The Congo's Patrice Lumumba, Chile's Salvador Allende, Iran's Mohammad Mossadegh, all were democratically chosen leaders overthrown with Western involvement because they challenged Western economic interests or were perceived as too friendly with the Soviet bloc. The Soviet Union played similar games, supporting movements and governments, that aligned with its ideology while crushing dissent within its own sphere of influence. Economic development proved frustratingly difficult. The international economic system remained structured to favor former colonial powers. New nations produced raw materials, cocoa, coffee, minerals, whose prices were set by global markets they did not control. They imported manufactured goods at prices that ensured wealth continued flowing from former colonies to former colonizers. Attempts at rapid industrialization often failed, creating debt without producing sustainable growth. International financial institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, dominated by Western powers, imposed structural adjustment programs that prioritized debt repayment and market liberalization over social welfare and national development goals. The promise of economic independence remained largely unfulfilled, even as political independence was celebrated. Yet there were also genuine achievements and reasons for hope. India, despite poverty and enormous challenges, maintained democratic governance through decades when many predicted it would collapse into dictatorship or fragmentation. It built institutions of higher learning that produced world-class scientists, engineers, and thinkers. It preserved unity despite extraordinary diversity. In Africa, countries like Botswana used diamond wealth wisely, investing in education and infrastructure while maintaining democratic governance. Tanzania under Nyerere, though economically unsuccessful in many ways, built one of Africa's most literate societies and fostered a genuine sense of national identity. Singapore transformed from a poor colonial port into a wealthy modern city-state through disciplined development policies. These successes proved that post-colonial development was possible, even if the path was difficult and the obstacles enormous. Cultural decolonization proved as important as political liberation. Writers, artists, and intellectuals across the formerly colonized world worked to reclaim their histories and identities from imperial narratives. They wrote in indigenous languages suppressed under colonial rule, told stories from perspectives empire had silenced, created art that drew on traditional forms while engaging with modern realities. This cultural renaissance was itself a form of decolonization, reclaiming the right to define oneself rather than accepting definitions imposed by others. Universities in former colonies began teaching their own histories rather than focusing exclusively on European history. Museums returned some stolen artifacts, though most remain in Western institutions. The psychological liberation from colonial mentalities proved as necessary and as difficult as political liberation. By the end of the 20th century, the formal structures of empire had collapsed completely. The last significant colonial holding, Hong Kong, returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1997. The world of the early 21st century was one of nation-states, at least formally equal members of international institutions, no longer divided into colonizers and colonized. Yet empire's legacy persisted in countless ways, in economic inequalities, in political instabilities, in cultural conflicts, in the psychological scars carried by societies that had been told for generations they were inferior. Decolonization had been a monumental achievement, but it was not an ending. It was a beginning, the start of a long process of building just, prosperous, democratic societies from the ruins empire left behind. That process continues still, unfinished and uncertain, shaped by choices made in the present as much as by the weight of the past. And so the empires fell, brought down by the courage and sacrifice of those who refused to remain subjects, by the changing tides of global power, by the simple unsustainability of systems built on domination. New nations rose from their ashes, imperfect and struggling but free. As you drift toward deeper sleep now, let this chapter settle gently into your consciousness. A reminder that history is not fixed, that systems that seem permanent can be dismantled, that oppressed peoples can free themselves. The fall of empires was neither quick nor complete, but it happened, and the world, for all its continued problems, was transformed. Rest now, and when we meet again, we will explore how empire's legacy continues to shape our world today. The empires have fallen, but their architecture remains. Walk through any major city in the formerly colonized world, and you will see it. Grand colonial buildings that now house government ministries, railway stations built to extract resources that still carry commuters' street names, that honor conquering generals' monuments to imperial power that stand awkwardly in independent nations. But the legacy of imperialism runs far deeper than physical structures. It lives in economic systems, political borders, cultural hierarchies, and the very ways people understand themselves and their place in the world. The formal end of colonialism did not erase centuries of domination. It transformed them into new forms that persist in the 21st century. This final chapter examines how imperialism continues to shape our world, sometimes obviously, often invisibly, always powerfully. And it asks the difficult questions: can the damage ever be undone? What would justice look like? And how do we move forward without forgetting? The global economic order remains structured by imperialism's logic. Former colonies continue to export raw materials, oil, minerals, agricultural products, to former colonizers who transform them into manufactured goods and sell them back at enormous profit. This pattern, established during colonial rule, persists through market mechanisms that seem natural, but are actually the result of centuries of structured inequality. When cocoa farmers in Ghana receive a tiny fraction of the price of chocolate sold in European supermarkets, when cobalt miners in Congo earn poverty wages while their minerals power smartphones around the world, when coffee growers struggle while coffee companies make billions. These are not accidents of free markets, but continuations of colonial extraction dressed in new language. International financial institutions perpetuate these patterns through debt and structural adjustment. Many developing nations inherited debt from colonial periods or borrowed heavily to fund post-independence development. When they struggled to repay, organizations like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank impose conditions, privatize public services, open markets to foreign competition, cut social spending. These policies, often called neocolonialism, maintain economic domination without formal political control. Former colonies retain sovereignty in name but have little real autonomy when their budgets must be approved by foreign creditors, when their resources are controlled by multinational corporations, when their economies are shaped by decisions made in Washington, London, and Paris. Political independence without economic independence is incomplete liberation. The borders drawn by colonial powers remain sources of conflict and instability. In Africa, virtually every border is artificial, reflecting European negotiations rather than African realities. These borders have fueled countless conflicts. Ethnic groups split between nations fight for reunification or autonomy. Artificial nations fragment along ethnic lines. Disputes over boundaries lead to wars. The Rwandan genocide had roots in colonial classifications of Hutu and Tutsi that Belgian colonizers rigidified and weaponized. The conflict in Sudan and later South Sudan reflects colonial borders that combine different peoples with no history of unity. Nigeria's ongoing tensions between North and South, Christian and Muslim regions reflect British administrative divisions designed for colonial convenience. Independence did not solve these problems because the borders themselves were the problem, and changing them seemed impossible without creating new conflicts. In the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, in which Britain and France secretly divided Ottoman territories between themselves, created borders and nations that have never achieved stability. Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, all were artificial creations of colonial powers pursuing their own interests. The conflicts that have ravaged the region for decades, the rise of movements seeking to erase these borders, the interventions by former colonial powers and new hegemons, all have roots in decisions made a century ago by empires that are gone, but whose choices still shape lives and deaths today. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict similarly traces back to British colonial policy, and promises made to different groups that proved impossible to reconcile. The region's instability cannot be understood without understanding imperialism's legacy. Language remains a complex legacy of colonialism. English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, languages of empire, now serve as national or official languages in dozens of countries that never asked for them. These languages facilitate international communication and access to global knowledge, but their dominance comes at the cost of indigenous languages that are dying at alarming rates. When children in former colonies learn mathematics and science in colonial languages because textbooks are not available in their mother tongues, when speaking European languages signals education and sophistication, while indigenous languages are dismissed as backward, when entire ways of thinking embedded in traditional languages disappear because there are no speakers left, this is cultural imperialism's ongoing work. Some nations, like Tanzania with its promotion of Swahili, have successfully built national identities around indigenous languages, but many others struggle with linguistic legacies that privilege European languages and marginalize their own. The psychological legacy of colonialism persists in subtle and profound ways. Generations of colonial education taught peoples across Africa, Asia, and the Americas that their cultures were inferior, their histories unimportant, their achievements insignificant compared to European civilization. This internalized racism did not vanish with independence. It lives in preferences for light skin over dark, in the prestige associated with Western education and degrees, in the assumption that progress means becoming more like the West. It appears in advertisements that promote European beauty standards, in elites who send their children to schools in former colonial capitals, in the lingering shame some feel about indigenous traditions. Decolonizing minds, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote, is as necessary as decolonizing territories, but it is harder work that happens one person, one generation at a time. Yet former colonial subjects have also reclaimed narratives and challenged imperial legacies in powerful ways. The global movement for racial justice, from civil rights struggles in the United States to anti-apartheid activism in South Africa, to contemporary movements confronting police violence and systemic racism, all draw on traditions of resistance that stretch back through centuries of colonial oppression. Indigenous peoples worldwide have organized to protect their lands, revive their languages, and demand recognition of rights denied during colonial periods. These movements represent ongoing decolonization, the work of dismantling not just formal empire, but the structures of thinking and power that empire created. Museums and cultural institutions have become battlegrounds over imperial legacy. The British Museum houses the Parthenon marbles taken from Greece, the Benin bronzes looted from Nigeria, countless artifacts seized during colonial rule. Similar institutions across Europe and North America display treasures that many argue should be returned to their places of origin. The debate over repatriation reflects deeper questions about who owns history, who has the right to interpret and display cultural heritage, and what former colonial powers owe to societies they once ruled. Some items have been returned. France has begun repatriating artifacts to Benin and Senegal, but the vast majority remain in Western museums that claim to be protecting world heritage while benefiting from colonial theft. Migration patterns reflect imperialism's lasting impact. Millions from former colonies have moved to former colonizing countries, seeking economic opportunity, education, or refuge from conflicts rooted in colonial legacies. South Asians in Britain, North Africans in France, Indonesians in the Netherlands. These communities represent imperial history coming home. Their presence has transformed formerly homogeneous European societies into multicultural ones, though not without tension, discrimination, and debates over national identity. The irony is rich. Colonizers once claimed the right to move freely through the world they ruled, but now resist the movement of peoples from formerly colonized regions. Immigration policies that make it difficult for Africans to enter Europe while European tourists move freely across Africa echo colonial hierarchies of who has the right to mobility. Climate change adds another dimension to imperialism's legacy. The Industrial Revolution that powered European imperialism was fueled by fossil fuels, whose emissions are now causing global warming. Yet the nations that contributed least to climate change, many in Africa and Asia, suffer its worst effects. Rising seas threaten island nations, droughts devastate agricultural societies, extreme weather disrupts already fragile economies. Former colonial powers, having built their wealth through carbon emissions and resource extraction, now lecture developing nations about limiting their own development to combat climate change. The question of climate justice is inseparable from colonial history. Who caused the problem, who suffers most from it, and who should bear the cost of addressing it, are all shaped by centuries of imperial extraction and inequality. China's rise presents a new chapter in this story. As Western dominance that followed colonial empires begins to wane, China has expanded its influence across Africa, Asia, and Latin America through investments, loans, and infrastructure projects. Some see this as neocolonialism with Chinese characteristics, debt diplomacy that traps nations' independence, extraction of resources, pursuit of Chinese interests dressed as mutual development. Others view it as an opportunity for formerly colonized nations to partner with a power that was itself victimized by Western imperialism and might offer better terms than Western institutions. The reality is complex and varies by country and project, but the dynamic reveals that imperialism's end did not create equality. It created a multipolar world where new forms of domination compete with old ones. Education systems in many former colonies still reflect imperial values and priorities. Curricula emphasize European history and literature while teaching little about local traditions and achievements. Tests and standards favor Western knowledge systems while marginalizing indigenous ways of knowing. Universities in former colonies often aspire to match Western institutions rather than developing their own models rooted in local contexts and needs. This intellectual dependency maintains colonial hierarchies, where knowledge produced in the West is valued more highly than knowledge from the global South, where scholars from former colonies must publish in Western journals to gain recognition, where local expertise is dismissed until it receives Western validation. Yet resistance and innovation continue. Scholars across the formerly colonized world are producing knowledge that challenges Western frameworks, reviving indigenous epistemologies, and creating new ways of understanding history, politics, and society that do not center Europe. Artists are blending traditional forms with contemporary concerns, creating culture that is both rooted and cosmopolitan. Activists are building movements that learn from anti-colonial struggles while addressing today's challenges. Technology is being used to preserve endangered languages, document suppressed histories, and connect dispersed communities. The work of decolonization continues not as a single event, but as an ongoing process of dismantling imperial structures and building alternatives. The question of reparations haunts discussions of imperial legacy. Should former colonial powers compensate societies they exploited for centuries? The moral case seems clear. Wealth was stolen, lives were destroyed, development was derailed. Britain extracted an estimated $45 trillion from India during colonial rule. Belgium's exploitation of Congo killed millions and left the nation impoverished. The transatlantic slave trade built American and European wealth on stolen African labor. Yet implementing reparations faces enormous practical and political obstacles. How do you calculate damages from centuries of exploitation? Who receives compensation? Governments, communities, individuals? Who pays? Contemporary citizens of former colonial powers who personally committed no crimes. These questions have no easy answers, yet the demand for reparations reflects a fundamental truth. Imperialism's benefits and costs were never equally distributed, and that inequality persists. Some forms of redress are occurring, though inadequately. The Netherlands apologized for its role in the slave trade. France acknowledged its responsibility for complicity in the Rwandan genocide. Germany recognized its genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in Namibia. These acknowledgements matter symbolically, validating suffering long denied, but they rarely include substantial material compensation. Caribbean nations have formed a CARICOM reparations commission demanding reparations from European nations for slavery and colonial exploitation. The calls grow louder as inequalities deepen and the moral bankruptcy of simply moving on becomes clearer. Whether meaningful reparations will ever occur remains uncertain, but the conversation itself represents a reckoning with imperial history that previous generations avoided. International law and human rights frameworks, often celebrated as universal values, actually emerged from and partly reflect imperial contexts. The United Nations was created by victorious powers after World War II, and its Security Council gives permanent seats and veto power to former colonial empires. International humanitarian law developed partly to regulate colonial wars. The concept of failed states often applies to nations struggling with problems colonialism created, justifying interventions that echo imperial civilizing missions. Even human rights discourse, with its emphasis on individual rights, can conflict with communal values in societies where collective rights and responsibilities matter more than individual autonomy. This does not mean these frameworks have no value, but it requires recognizing they are not neutral or universal. They carry historical baggage that shapes who gets to define rights, whose violations receive attention, and what solutions are deemed acceptable. The persistence of racial hierarchies globally reflects imperialism's legacy. Lighter-skinned people generally enjoy advantages over darker-skinned people, regardless of where they live. This colorism crosses national boundaries and cultures, appearing in marriage preferences, employment discrimination, beauty standards, and social status. It traces directly to colonial ideologies that ranked races and justified European supremacy through pseudo-scientific racism. Though formal racial hierarchies have been legally dismantled in most places, informal hierarchies persist in housing patterns, wealth distribution, political representation, and everyday interactions. Addressing these requires confronting not just contemporary discrimination, but the deep roots it has in imperial history. Technology and globalization create new forms of dependency that echo colonial patterns. Smartphones require minerals from Congo, mined under dangerous conditions for minimal pay. Fast fashion relies on garment workers in Bangladesh, earning poverty wages in unsafe factories. Agricultural exports from Africa feed European and American consumers, while local populations sometimes go hungry. These supply chains are not technically colonial. The nations involved are formally independent, but the power dynamics and wealth flows mirror colonial extraction. Global corporations headquartered in former colonial powers extract resources and labor from former colonies, generating profits that accumulate in wealthy nations while leaving poverty in their wake. This economic neocolonialism is in some ways harder to resist than formal empire because it operates through markets that seem neutral rather than through obvious political domination. Yet globalization also creates opportunities for formerly colonized peoples to tell their own stories and challenge dominant narratives. Nigerian authors like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie reach global audiences, offering African perspectives on identity, history, and society. Bollywood rivals. Hollywood in cultural influence, spreading Indian culture worldwide. K-pop and Korean cinema have global followings, demonstrating that cultural power need not flow only from west to east. Social media allows activists from the global south to build international movements, bypassing traditional media controlled by Western corporations. These developments do not erase power imbalances, but they create spaces for voices long marginalized to be heard, for histories long suppressed to be told, for cultures long dismissed to be celebrated. education about imperial history remains contested and incomplete. In former colonial powers, school curricula often sanitize imperial history, emphasizing supposed benefits of colonialism while downplaying or ignoring the violence, exploitation, and cultural destruction it involved. British students learn about the British Empire's extent and achievements, but often little about famines in India, massacres in Kenya, or the slave trade's brutality. French students hear about the civilizing mission, but not about torture in Algeria or exploitation in Africa. American students study westward expansion as manifest destiny without fully confronting Native American genocide. This historical amnesia makes it difficult for citizens of former colonial powers to understand why their nations remain disproportionately wealthy and powerful, why immigrants arrive seeking opportunities, or why international resentments persist. Honest reckoning with imperial history threatens comfortable national narratives, but without it, meaningful reconciliation and justice remain impossible. In formerly colonized societies, teaching about imperialism faces different challenges. Emphasizing colonial oppression can foster victim mentalities that inhibit taking responsibility for contemporary problems. Focusing too much on resistance heroes can create simplistic narratives that ignore collaboration and complexity. Balancing acknowledgement of imperial damage with agency and resilience is difficult but necessary. The most effective approaches neither minimize imperial violence nor portray colonized peoples as helpless victims. They recognize that history is complex, that imperialism profoundly shaped the world while also generating resistance and adaptation, that understanding the past helps navigate the present without being imprisoned by it. As this long journey through imperialism's history approaches its end, we are left with difficult truths. The empires have fallen, but their legacies persist in economics, politics, culture, and psychology. Independence was won, but true decolonization remains incomplete. The world has changed dramatically, yet fundamental inequalities established during imperial centuries endure. Justice has not been achieved, and whether it ever will be achieved remains uncertain. But understanding this history, really understanding it, not sanitizing it or reducing it to simple narratives of villains and heroes, is essential for navigating our present and building different futures. The work continues, the questions remain open, and history, as always, is not finished with us yet. The night deepens now, and our journey through imperialism's long shadow comes to rest. We have traveled from the first ships that sailed into unknown waters, through the age when empires divided the world like a feast, into the machinery that reshaped societies from within, and through the struggles and sacrifices of those who refused to remain subjects. We witnessed the fall of empires and the difficult birth of new nations, and we have seen how the past lives on in the present, shaping a world that still bears the marks of conquest and exploitation, resistance and survival. This history is not comfortable. It does not offer easy heroes or simple lessons. It shows us humanity at its worst, the capacity for greed, cruelty, and the dehumanization of others. But it also reveals humanity at its best, courage in the face of overwhelming power, the refusal to surrender dignity, the preservation of memory and identity against all odds, and the tireless work of building justice from the ruins of oppression. Imperialism changed the world forever. It connected distant peoples in relationships of profound inequality. It extracted wealth and resources on an unprecedented scale. It destroyed cultures and created new ones. It drew borders that ignore human realities. It built systems that persist long after the empires themselves have fallen. Understanding this history does not mean dwelling in guilt or grievance. It means recognizing how the past shapes the present, how choices made centuries ago still influence who prospers and who struggles, whose stories are told and whose are forgotten. The work of decolonization is not finished. It continues in the efforts of nations to build just societies from colonial foundations. It lives in movements demanding economic justice and reparations. It appears in the work of scholars, artists, and activists reclaiming narratives and identities. It happens in conversations about how to remember history honestly, how to acknowledge wrongs without being paralyzed by them, how to move forward while honoring those who suffered and resisted. As you drift now into sleep, carry with you not despair, but understanding. History is not destiny. The structures imperialism created can be challenged and changed. The inequalities it established can be addressed. The narratives it imposed can be rewritten. This requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to face difficult truths. But if the history we have shared tonight teaches anything, it is that human beings have an extraordinary capacity to resist oppression, to survive catastrophe, to hope for better futures, and to work toward them even when success seems distant. The empires rose and fell, the world was transformed, and now the work of building something better continues, shaped by history but not imprisoned by it. Sleep now, knowing that every generation inherits the world made by those who came before and has the power, however limited, to remake it for those who will come after. Let history be your teacher, not your master. Let memory guide you toward justice, not bind you to endless cycles of revenge. And let the stories of those who resisted, who survived, who dreamed of freedom and fought for it, inspire the quiet work of making a more just world. Rest well, the night is yours, and tomorrow the work continues.